With all the excitement around OP07, I wanted to go over some recent spoilers that came out around blue events, blue cards that potentially might be some Nami support coming in OP07. I wanted to go over some guidelines as to how we should be evaluating cards as Nami players, and then ultimately match those guidelines with these 3 cards that I want to talk about, going over their pros and cons, and whether or not ultimately they're fit for the Nami mill deck. If you want to see more videos like this, then leave a like on the video and comment down below what type of videos you want to see. And of course, if you have any comments on the video in general, maybe there's a card I'm missing, or there's an evaluation piece that I'm missing, some type of synergy, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. But let's hop right into it. The first section that I want to talk about in general is card evaluation guidelines. So these are some of the things that I want you as a Nami player, novice or experienced, to be thinking about when you are looking at these cards, blue events, blue characters, because the old meme is that if the card draws a card, then it's Nami support. But of course, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. There's a lot of cards in our deck that draw 2 cards, mill more, are recurable, blah, blah, blah. So these things are really important to, kind of fit in to what the deck has. A lot of times the deck only has like 3 to 4 flex slots in the deck, or else you have to kind of change the package altogether. So the card has to be really good in order to do that. So first guideline is, does it draw cards? Does it actually draw 2 cards, draw 1 card, whatever? Or does it just kind of like search for a card, like whatever it does? Does it take cards out of your deck into your hand or into another zone so your deck size shrinks? Does it net you cards? That's a very different distinction. So there's a lot of blue cards that have been coming out recently that not only draw cards, but you put the cards back into your deck. So that doesn't net you cards. It's not shrinking the size of your deck. It's providing you more cards, more options. It's kind of selection, but it's not removing cards from your deck. So we have to be very careful with cards like that and the type of advantages that they're providing. Does it buff your leader and characters defensively? So firstly, this is a 2-pronged one. Does it buff your leaders and characters? You have cards like Gum Gum Gavel that do not buff your characters. They only buff leaders. So having the ability to buff your leaders and characters is a big bonus. And then defensively, Bandai's not going to print an offensive card that gives your character a boost and then like you mill or draw cards. They're going to leader lock the living crap out of that. They're not going to give that to Nami. So I'm going to be completely honest. The card needs to be defensively boosting. Okay. Don't look to be, looking at combat buffs unless Bandai gives that to us. Is it a counter ability? If so, big bonus there. If it's an offensive ability, that has to be drawing us like 2 cards or something like that. It's got to be like Mihawk or something, but Bandai's not giving that to us. If it's a character doesn't have a counter, cards like Usopp come to mind, where it doesn't have any counter, but it has that Zeff effect and it has Rush. So it's this great like surprise card that you can pull onto your opponent. And then Mihawk is like a character that can attack but has a 2k counter. But if a card doesn't have a counter, it better have a very high ceiling, which Usopp does. Again, card that can be played in Nami decks, and I would highly recommend it as a card that a lot of people try out because of that Zeff effect, and be very powerful if it lands. Next up, we have, can you recur or bounce the characters or events? So bouncing characters, stuff like Kaya can be bounced because it's relatively cheap. And then Zeff, can it be bounced with Zeff? Can you bounce the Zeff itself? Can it bounce other characters as well? And then recurring events, do the events return from your trash to your hand? Can you recur them from Mr. 1? Things like that. If you can play cards multiple times, with its cost and meeting some of the requirements of the Nami deck with those recursions, it can be very powerful. And then finally, is it searchable? Obviously, we have different searchers available in blue, but the more traditional one is Buggy at the moment because it gets Mr. 1, it gets Impel down Allstars, it gets Deathwink, it gets Brickfist. That's really going to be the cut there. There are other searches that we could be playing, but they have to have a pretty high ceiling in terms of what it can search, how it can search, and stuff like that. So Buggy is the kind of de facto searcher. It can get 4 cards that exist in the deck already. Removing that card doesn't meet that condition. Let's hop into the first card itself. That's going to be Marguerite, OP07. It's a rare, and I do want to bring that up just because there aren't a lot of reprints happening in this game right now, so a rare can be pretty inaccessible. It's a 3-cost 2k character with Amazon Lily type. It's a blocker and says on play draw a card. So this is kind of meeting that meme structure of like, hey, is it Nami support? It draws a card, so we're here to evaluate it. It has blocker, which is a pretty big bonus. It's an Amazon Lily type, which isn't necessarily searchable, and it doesn't have a counter. So let's go over the pros and cons specifically for this card. Now, firstly, the pros, we're looking at a card that that is a blocker. It's going to provide that protection against a Zeff that swung in, and that's going to be very great for also protecting your Nami if they don't remove it. Now in OP05, there's a lot of removal going around that's likely going to be continuing, but again, this has blocker, which is still relevant, could be a lightning rod for that. It replaces itself with the draw, you know, that kind of baseline of Nami support. It is netting you cards in the sense that you are removing cards from your deck, so that's nice there. It can be bounced by Zeff, as I had mentioned, being 3 cost. That just meets that guideline right there. So, you know, you could play this as a blocker and then play Zeff, bounce this back to your hand, draw a card again. So that's kind of nice as well. The cons of this, though, there are plenty. Firstly, there's no counter on it. So it has to have a pretty high ceiling to not have a counter. It's got to be like Usopp level stuff that has rush, has that Zeff effect. Doesn't really have that. Blocker isn't that, you know, crazy. If this card drew 2 cards, then we might be in business. But again, no counter, draw 1 card. I don't know. Not a searchable type. Amazon Lily is not searchable by Buggy. There are other cards that are going to be able to search up Amazon Lily, but come on, there's not a lot of other cards in the deck that are Amazon Lily, if at all. So not great there. And then isn't Hina just better? Hina's a 3-cost 5k card that you usually see in Sakazuki's decks in OP05, and it says it's a on play ability, draw a card if you have 5 or less cards in your hand, which is honestly great because you are usually emptying your hand with stuff like Gavels, throwing out a bunch of counters to enable stuff like Deathwinks and your Love Mellows. So generally you can meet that condition, but that card's not even really played. Now, of course, this being blocker is just a different condition, but that card can be pretty offensive too. There's a lot of 5k power stuff in the game right now, so you can swing offensively into that, get cards out of your opponent's hand. That can be pretty valuable too in that sense as well. But ultimately speaking, I don't think this card is playable at all. Let's go into Slave Arrow. OP07 for an uncommon, more accessible that way. Counter. The reason I'm highlighting the black is actually a cost. It's not part of the effect. This is a cost. So you have to meet this cost in order to get the unhighlighted text. That's very key. So counter, you may return one of your cost 2 or higher characters to its opponent's hand, or to its owner's hand. So you have to have a cost 2 or higher character on the field to use this card. You cannot activate this with Kaya, cannot activate this with Mr. 1. For now, the deck really is only going to be able to use Zeff for this. Now, give up to one of your leaders or characters plus 4k during this battle. Next, the trigger says draw 2 cards, place 2 cards from your hand at the bottom of your deck. Now, it's a draw 2, but it's not netting you cards. You're putting cards at the bottom, so you're making your late game technically pretty bad because you're going to be putting cards that you necessarily don't want right now. Obviously, you could be putting at the bottom, you know, cards like Deathwink, which are going to be pretty good, and then you are going to want to draw into, and then you're going to be able to push those back to the top with stuff like Buggy, putting more cards at the bottom, pushing those back up. But again, you're usually going to be putting your worst cards at the bottom, which again might make your late game pretty hard. So let's go over the pros and cons. So pros, it's cheap, it's 1 cost, it's recurable by Mr. 1 because of its cheap cost, so that's a big bonus there. Can recur Zeff, which is important because part of the cost is that you can bounce card 2 plus to give the bounce. So you can recur a Zeff to protect your leader, recur a Usopp to protect your leader, protect another character, whatever it might be. So that's a big bonus there. And it buffs leaders and characters. So that's important to note because, again, as I mentioned, something like Gum Gum Gavel does not do that. It only protects your leaders, doesn't protect characters. That's a big thing to mention for 4k, but the cons are pretty big. First of all, it's not searchable. I don't believe the translation has Kuja Pirates, or sorry, the translation doesn't tell us if it's Kuja Pirates or animal, but I'm going off the fact that I believe this is like a Boa card. So Boa generally is looking for like Kuja Pirates and animal type cards. So the translation will likely give us those 2 types. And so it's not going to be searchable in that sense. That's the prediction. Anyway, you have to return a character for the counter. You have to have a Zeff or Usopp out. Right now, Nami is not playing. Generally speaking, Nami is not playing characters that can meet this condition. Having a Zeff out is not that common. Against removal heavy matchups, Zeff is usually just a 1k counter. You're not even playing Zeff most of the time. So that's a huge downside there. At least with something like Impel down Allstars, outside of the sim, you can actually just use that to empty cards out of your hand to enable a Deathwink or a Gum Gum Gavel. You can actually still cost that card. This is actually truly a dead card, like on an empty field. This is actually actually a dead card, which blows my mind. So big downside there. And then you still net the same cards in deck off the trigger. Remember, the trigger says draw 2 and place 2 cards at the bottom. You are still at the same amount of cards in your deck, and it's like you haven't really been able to rearrange much because you have to put them at the bottom. So when you compare this to a card like Spada, people be like, oh, you can put those cards at the bottom. Spada, I can still keep the cards at top to, you know, kind of enable what I want to draw, enable what I want to discard off a gavel or a rubber band. I can put those cards away in the late game if I'm like trying to enable a Deathwing and I don't want to draw those cards. Like, you're forced into that decision, and you're usually, if you're using this early, somehow if you're enabling the front side, you're forced to put your worst cards at the bottom, making your late game even worse. I don't think this card is playable at all. I don't think this is Nami support. I think just the fact that you have to return a character 2 cost or more makes this card actually awful. I really hope I'm missing something. Let me know in the comment section down below. This whole section could be garbage, but like, I'm like 95% sure you have to return a character 2 or more to enable this card. Not good in this deck at all. Let's go to the final card that I want to talk about in this video. Snake Dance, OP07 for a common. Now, again, very accessible. That's great. We want to see cards like this that are really easy to find in packs. People can buy relatively. Again, just because there aren't a lot of reprints happening, cards are really hard to buy these days. So commons are great. So it's a Kuja Pirates type. Counter, give up to one of your leader or characters plus 4K during this battle. Great. So not a conditional 4K so far. That's great. Then return one of your characters to its owner's hand. Notice how it's not 4 CMC or less, 3 CMC or less. Unconditional bounce to your hand plus a 4K boost. Okay. Now the trigger, you may return one of your characters to its owner's hand. Now this, you have to have a character out, but the restriction doesn't require any costs. So it could just be any character, which is a lot easier if you have like a Buggy, a Kaya, whatever. You can return any one of your characters, but you have to have one still, which is noted, to activate the trigger. And then it says the trigger is return up to one of your opponent's cost 5 or lower characters to its owner's hand. So it's kind of nice because it's a free way to return one of your cards if you have it, and it has like a Nojiko style effect, that bounce effect. So it's going to be a little bit of removal off the trigger, which is kind of nice. We already see other cards that are doing that, the Gavel trigger, the Deathwing trigger. So we are playing cards that already do that, but character recursion is actually really powerful. So let's go into the pros and cons of this card. Firstly, the pros are going to be that it's like cheap asterisk. So it's like 2 costs, which is still cheap. It's not like the Deathwing 3, which is like a lot of Dawn. I'm going to call 2 like relatively affordable. So it's like cheap asterisk. Unrestricted character bounce is so powerful. I cannot understate this. So cards like Overheat force you to bounce a 3 cost or less active character. There's so many restrictions on the bounce that we have in this game right now. Unrestricted character bounce is huge. Just being able to bounce your own Usopps, your own Zeffs, like whatever it might be, just being able to recur those is so big. So unrestricted character bounce is big points for this card. Buffs leaders and characters. Again, Gavel only hits your leaders. Being able to do this off of 2 costs, just like Love Mellow, just like White Snake. Big bonus to this card. And then has that Nojiko style bounce trigger. I always talk about how decks should be playing more Nojiko. I love to see that trigger. You know, 5 costs or more is huge. Brickfist only doing 4, Gavel only doing 4, Deathwing doing 7, but like having to use Deathwing, like I think a lot of times you'd rather just have a Deathwing in your hand. Like having 5 costs or more is a huge piece of removal. There's a lot more cards you could be getting. Very powerful effect. The cons of this card, not searchable or recurable with Mr. 1. So it's generally not going to be searchable with the current effects that we have, not recurable with Mr. 1. So Buggy can't search this, Mr. 1 can't get this. You need to have a character in play for this trigger, but this is a lot less of a downside because the character doesn't have a cost restriction like Slave Arrow does. So that's going to be really nice. You get that kind of character bounce. You bounce your own character, your own Kaya, to save that or like just have that ready as a 2K counter. And then your opponent, you know, has to bounce another 5 cost as well. So that's a big bonus as well with this card. I think ultimately this is the most playable piece of Nami support coming out of OP07. Decklist may change based on how the metagame and different leaders are playing. So in general, if we're playing less characters, maybe this card gets worse. Like we take out all the Buggies, less Mr. 1s. We'll see how the metagame evolves eventually. But I think this is going to be the most playable piece of Nami support coming out of OP07. This card is really sweet. I'm so excited to test with this card. Having like almost like better overheat is so exciting to me. I love the character bounce. The recursion is so key. Having the ability to reuse characters over and over again is so powerful in this deck. Forget just recurring Kayas, like recurring your Zeffs, recurring your Mr. Ones to get back Gavels, recurring your Buggies to look for Deathwinks. Like stuff like that is so powerful. So I think a card like this, slam dunk. But let me know what you think. That's pretty much the end of the 3 cards that I want to talk about. What do you think about the 3 cards there? Do you think any one of them are playable that I said were unplayable? Do you think Snake Dance is completely unplayable as well? I want to hear your thoughts down below. I want to hear what you're thinking of these cards, what you're thinking about Nami going into OP07. And honestly, what are your thoughts about Nami going into OP06 if you're in the Western meta right now? Where is Nami in the metagame there? Right now, Nami's a really kind of top deck in the metagame in OP05. It seems like okay in OP06, but the Western meta is going to have to catch up and really provide those numbers. So we'll see what happens. We'll see how this deck really evolves. I'm really excited going into OP07.